Good evening and welcome to Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University's Gail Lemeron Auditorium for the final installment of the Embry-Riddle Speaker Series for the fall of 2017. I'm Marc Bernier, the moderator for tonight's event. Who would have thought that years after journalism hit television from newspapers and radio, we'd be talking about fake news? And who thought we'd have hundreds of different news outlets to choose from? It's really overload, which is why tonight our speaker is speaking about that very subject of information overload, from the election we just had to what may lie in the future. So we are bringing back an old friend of Embry-Riddle's, someone who was a mentor to me, so this is especially fun for me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask you to give a warm Embry-Riddle Speaker Series welcome for the former host of Face the Nation and the author of the new book that we're talking about tonight, Overload. Ladies and gentlemen, CBS's Bob Schieffer. Good to see you again, Bob.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm glad to be here. Can I just say one thing? I had no idea. You know, I wish my wife could have come tonight. She never thinks anybody comes to these things. To have a crowd like this, I had no idea. Now, I just got to tell one little story, because when I walked in the door, it reminded me of it. Some years back, I was making a talk down at Louisiana College, which is deep in the heart of the Bayou country. And it was a beautiful spring day, very much like this beautiful day we had here today. And every seat in the auditorium was filled. Kids were sitting in the aisles. They were sitting up in the balcony. It was not air conditioned. And there were these big old-fashioned windows that ran down one side of the auditorium. They were all raised. Kids were sitting in the windowsill. And I looked out the window right next to the speaker's podium, and three boys had climbed up into a tree. And they were sitting there, you know, looking in to hear me speak. And I was really, it almost kind of choked me up. I said, I can't believe that young people would come out on a beautiful spring day like this to hear me. And a kid on the front row said, well, it's mandatory. So I'm just going to hope nobody made you come tonight. And I really appreciate you coming. And it's a wonderful thing to look out and see. And I hope we'll have some fun tonight, and maybe we can figure out something about what's going on these days. Maybe you can help me. I'm not sure I know the answer yet. Go ahead, Mark.
Your wife that you mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, this is, I believe, 50 years. You've been married to Patricia?
April 15th of this year, 50 years. And I'll be glad to tell you the secret. She would tell you the same things. And number one, she's got a great sense of humor. And number two, I've never allowed guns around the house. I wouldn't be here. She's a great woman. I love her to death.
The book is available on audio as well as the hardcover books that are being sold by our partners at the bookstore. And Bob will be signing copies of the book immediately following our interview. And I was thinking this morning that when I went through journalism, and I didn't have the privilege of going to TCU, but the first rule of journalism was, is it true?
Yeah. And
if it's not true, then you don't report it. So we would have had no room for fake news when I was coming up.
Well, exactly. And that's what the problem is. We have right now access to more information than any people who've ever lived on the earth at any one time. But the question is, are we wiser, or are we simply overwhelmed with so much information that we can't process it? And the answer, I believe, is that we're overwhelmed at this point, and that's what the book is about. This is a book about the remarkable revolution in communications technology that we're all going through now, and the impact that it is having on all of our institutions, and no institutions have been more impacted in America than our politics and how we get our news. And some of what's happened is very good news. We can now send information around the world and back in a matter of seconds. But the other part is now the nuts can all find each other. And no matter how extreme, how weird, how crazy your view is, if you get on the web, you're going to find somebody that agrees with you, and that is having a tremendous impact on us. I argue in the book that I think this revolution in communication technology that we're going through right now is having as great an impact on our culture, all parts of our culture, as the invention of the printing press had on the people of Europe of that day. And we all remember what a wonderful thing the coming of the printing press was. Within years, people began, literacy improved all across Europe. We had the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation. What we sometimes forget is that we also had about 30 years of religious wars before Europe reached some sort of equilibrium. And we are in the midst of an even more profound revolution right now, and we're nowhere near equilibrium. We're, I think, right now basically in the first trimester of this, and we're still working our way through it. Some of the bad news, let me just talk about that first, is the impact that it's had on local newspapers all across America. We have lost 126 newspapers in the last 12 years in the United States. In 21 of the 50 states, there is not a single newspaper that has a Washington correspondent. In my home state of Texas, which is huge, a state of 20-something million people, and yet some newspapers are so strapped for funds because with the coming of the web, the advertising that was once the lifeblood of local newspapers went away to eBay and other places on the web. And these local newspapers are having a very difficult time finding a business model to allow them to hire the reporters that are needed to do what local newspapers used to do. And so in Texas, you have many newspapers that no longer even send a correspondent to Austin, which is the state capital, to cover the legislature and the state government. This is having a profound effect in many different ways all across America. One of the most interesting statistics that I ran across, Mark, when I wrote this book was in 2004, 1 reporter in 8 lived in one of 3 metropolitan areas, New York, Washington, or Los Angeles. This year, that number is down to one reporter in 5 lives in New York, Washington, or Los Angeles. What that means is that in many parts of the country, especially as you move up through the middle of the country into the Rust Belt, it's not a question of biased news, it's a question of no news. They're getting no news except what they get on social media. And as all of you know and recognize, just because it's on Facebook doesn't mean it has been vetted before it's been published in the way that your local newspaper used to check out things, the way that the mainstream media, I think, still does, check out things, and if they're not true, we don't broadcast them or we don't print them. Stuff pops up on Facebook now, you don't know where it comes from. And many times, in fact, a lot of the times, it's absolutely false. And what has complicated this even further is now that the Russian intelligence agencies have begun to manipulate our social media. In a recent congressional hearing, the officials of Facebook, this is not coming from one of our intelligence agencies or something like that, which have concluded that the Russians have meddled into our media, but the people at Facebook now admit that 126 million Americans received content on Facebook that came from foreign sources associated with Russian intelligence services. I was just down in Texas last week, and what they're pretty concerned about down there during the campaign, there was a website called Heart of America, which urged, Heart of Texas was the name of it. It urged Texans to secede from the Union. Well, it turns out this was not Texans urging other Texans to secede from the Union. This was a Russian intelligence agency disguised as a domestic website urging Texans to secede from the Union. There was another website that came to the fore during the election called Blacktivist. It urged black people who felt that they had been abused by the police to kill white people. There was another website called Patriotic Americans, which urged white people to kill black people if they thought they had been disrespectful of the flag. Again, these are Russian intelligence services disguised as domestic intelligence, domestic websites on social media that are putting this stuff into the mix. And as if it weren't complicated enough, and more difficult than ever to try to figure out what's a legitimate news site and what's not, now we have this complicating it even further.
Former CIA Director James Woolsey was here in October, and he bore that out. He said there are actually more people disseminating misinformation from Russia than actually serve in the military. That's how sophisticated this is.
Well, this is the Russian strategy now. I hear myself saying these things, and I'm old enough to remember, the 50s when people were afraid we had a communist hiding under every bush. You had the House Un-American Activities Committee. You had the blacklist in Hollywood and all that stuff. But the fact of the matter is, this is really, really serious, what these people are doing. And all across Europe, we have a scholar at CSIS, which is the think tank in Washington that I'm now affiliated with, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And her name is Heather Conley, and she's written this book called The Russian Playbook. And what she did is she went back and analyzed Russian activities in 5 different countries surrounding Russia. These are countries that used to be part of the old Soviet Union. And what the Russians are doing is they don't just drive their tanks across the borders anymore. Now they have found a much cheaper and more sophisticated way to do it. They use cyber warfare. They go in and they bribe the local officials. They make sweetheart deals with the real estate operators in these countries, loan them money. They try to undermine the press. They try to undermine the government in any way that they can using this fake news, as it were, and they've been very successful. I mean, some of these countries still go by the same names, their historic names, but again, they're basically under the control of Russia now. And it's clear during over the last year, Putin's aim is to split the United States off from NATO and to do what he can to try to destroy the NATO alliance. I mean, this is his strategic plan, and it's quite clear. And so when people say the Russians weren't meddling in our media, if they're not, this is the only place they're not, because this is what they're doing all across Europe and in all of the Western countries.
To borrow a journalistic sidebar,
yeah,
it was 18 years ago, Bob was here. And it was there in that interview that I learned 2 things about Bob, a historic moment in November that I'm going to ask him to talk about in a moment. But he was also a ball player. You were a ball player, and I didn't realize that. Were you a shortstop?
No, I played catcher for TCU, but my baseball career was rather short-lived. But I may be the only person in baseball who the highlight of his baseball career was how it ended. I played for TCU, and we were playing SMU, and Dizzy Dean's nephew, I don't know you all remember in baseball, Dizzy Dean had a brother called Daffy Dean, and his name was Paul. And well, anyway, Daffy Dean had a son, Paul Dean Jr., and he pitched for SMU, and he hit me in the eye, my left eye, and almost put my eye out. And because of that, my baseball career was coming to an end pretty quickly. It wasn't going. A catcher with a sore arm who's hitting about 220, there's not much future for him, and that's about where I was. But anyway, that was the end of it, and it also might have had something to do with me going into journalism. I always wanted to be a reporter ever since I was a little boy, but I was in ROTC when I was at TCU, Air Force ROTC, and I was going to pilot training, and I didn't get into the ROTC for noble reasons. There was a draft, and I thought it'd be better to be in the Air Force and maybe go to pilot training than it was to be a grunt and get drafted. So that's why I was in ROTC. But as a result of that, I then couldn't pass the physical. You had to be 20/20 uncorrected in your eyes, and I couldn't do it. So I spent my Air Force career flying the LSD, which is the large steel desk. Many of you in the Air Force will remember that. But it was great. But I was the editor of the base newspaper at Travis Air Force Base, and I always had journalism jobs. So as a result of that, I got my first job in journalism when I was at TCU in the summer of my sophomore year, and that'd be about 60 years ago. So I have been a reporter and have gotten a regular paycheck doing something to do with journalism for 60 years, and I'm kind of proud of that.
If you ever get the Face the Nation stories of Bob Schieffer, you'll hear this. People sat on the edge of their seat when Bob told this story. He was with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, I believe. It's 1963, and this is why it's so wonderful for us that Bob is visiting us today, because it was all those years ago, on November 22nd, John F. Kennedy, Dallas. Bob, tell them where you were and how the phone rings.
Well, I was the night police reporter at the Star-Telegram, and when President Kennedy came to Dallas on that fateful weekend, he went first to Houston, and then he went to San Antonio, then he spent the night in Fort Worth, and then the next day he got up and made a breakfast speech in Fort Worth and then went over to Dallas. Well, I saw him when he came in that night. I didn't actually see him, but I was working that night, and he came into Carswell Air Force Base. 10,000 people turned out to see him. It was just one of the most wonderful receptions that you could imagine. And anyway, but I didn't get off work till 3 o'clock in the morning, so I was sound asleep the next day when he was shot in Dallas. And my brother came in and woke me up and said, "You better get up and go to work. Said the president's been shot." And I was just in a complete fog. I got up, dressed. I went. By the time I got down to the office, he came over the radio that the president was dead. And I really kind of lost it for a minute there. And people were lined up all around the Star-Telegram because we were putting out these extras that day. It was the last of the great newspaper extras. And so I went up to the city desk and just trying to help out and do what I could. And I sat down and I was answering the phones, and a woman, I picked up a phone, and a woman said, "Is there anybody there who can give me a ride to Dallas?" And I said, "Well, lady, we don't run a taxi here, and besides, the president's been shot." And I'm trying to hang up the phone, and I hear this voice say, "Yes, I know. I heard on the radio, I think my son is the one they've arrested." And it was Lee Harvey Oswald's mother. And I forgot that part about running a taxi service. I said, "Where do you live?" And she told me, and it was a house out on the west side of Fort Worth. And I had a TR4 sports car in those days, and I thought, I can't take this woman over there to Dallas. It's about an hour and 15 minutes, 30-something miles away. And besides, the top was down, and it took about 20 minutes to get the top on the thing. And so anyway, I went to the auto editor of the paper. His name was Bill Foster, and the ethics of the profession were a little different in those days, and car dealers would always give the auto editor a car, and he would drive it all week, and then he'd do a report on it, a road report in the Sunday paper, and these are generally good reviews. I mean, see how that worked, free car, free gas. So anyway, I went back to Bill and I said, "What kind of car do you have this week?" And he said, "I've got a Cadillac sedan." He said, "I don't know why they gave me that." And I said, "Well, that's great." So we went up to the city editor and told him. So we went out there to the west side of Fort Worth, and they're standing on the curb of this address this woman had given me was this little woman in a white nurse's uniform, and she had a little blue travel bag, and so she got in the back seat with me, and Bill drove, and I interviewed her on the way over to Dallas, and got a pretty good story out of it, I must say. And when we got to the Dallas police station, again, the ethics were not quite the same in those days. There was no Miranda law. You didn't have to warn people they had a right to an attorney. There was no Gideon law that said the court had to appoint an attorney. None of that in those days. And we dealt with the cops just face to face all the time. And in fact, if people wanted to think we were cops, we let them think that. I always wore a snap brim hat as a police reporter, so I'd look like a detective. I never lied and said I was a detective, but if people wanted to believe that. So anyway, we get to the Dallas police station, and I just walked up to the first uniformed officer, and I said, I'm the one that brought Oswald's mother over here. Where can we put her where these reporters won't be talking to her? And I was only 26. I mean, I'm not sure I'd do that today. I know I wouldn't do it today. But anyway, they actually found me a little office back in the burglary squad and said, would this be all right? And I said, it'll be fine. And so we were back there. Well, the great advantage was this was before cell phones. And if you didn't have a phone, you didn't have a story. Well, I could go out in the hall where all the other reporters were and gather up information from our guys and take it back to this secret phone that we had and phone it in, and we just kept churning out these extras. And finally, about dark, she said, do you think they'd let me see my son? And I said, well, I don't know, I'll go ask. And they did that in those days. And I went and asked Captain Will Fritz, he was the chief of homicide. I said, she'd really like to see her son. And he said, yeah, we probably ought to do it. And when I say they did things like that, in those days, they didn't want people to think that they were beating up people, and so they'd bring them out and let them, and as you'll remember, a couple of times they paraded him down the hall for the same reason. So anyway, he said, yeah, we probably ought to do that, and we were ushered into this holding room off the jail, and they were going to bring Oswald down to talk to his mother, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this is going to be the story of I'll never get a better story than this. And finally, a guy standing over in the corner said, who are you? And I said, what? He said, are you a reporter? And I said, well, yeah. And he said, son, you get out of here. He said, if I see you again, I'm going to kill you. And I mean, he was probably overstating it, but he was mad, and he convinced me that he was telling the truth. So I made my apologies and got out of there, and that was the end of the story. But when people ask me, why are you still a reporter and everything, I mean, what other kind of profession could you have where you could have an adventure like that in the middle of a great tragedy like that? And, things like that. I had a couple other pretty big stories along the way down through the years, but that's why people want to be reporters. I mean, it's why I always wanted to be a reporter. I just never got over the kick I would get out of getting to go behind police lines when other people couldn't, or interviewing people that made news. I just loved that part of it, and so that's why that's why I'm still working.
You did just about every type of job in Washington, Capitol Hill.
Yeah.
You did White House too, did you?
Yes, 5 years.
Okay, and then Dan Rather was in and around that period. Did he follow you, or?
No, I came after Dan. When I came to CBS, Dan was the White House correspondent, and my first job, I covered general assignments for the first year, and it was the year of those Cambodia bombings, and we had all the demonstrations in Washington. So I spent about 7 months just going out every night covering every kind of demonstrator. I mean, I'd cover the kids, and they'd throw rocks at you, and then the cops would push you around, and then we'd get tear gassed about once a week. And I was sick the whole winter just from being tear gassed. But I mean, it wasn't just me. I mean, we all were doing that. But then after Nixon, and then I became the Pentagon correspondent. They fired the Pentagon correspondent, and they just sent me out there to cover a couple of briefings, and I quickly discovered this was indoor work, and it was a lot better than out there covering those demonstrators. And so I worked hard and lobbied to get that job, and I became the Pentagon correspondent, and then did that for 5 years. And then when Nixon resigned, Dan was transferred from the White House up to New York, and I became the White House correspondent after that.
Do you follow Leslie Stahl at Face the Nation?
I did, yes,
okay.
I did.
When you got into that, did that feel like, I feel in my career I've arrived? Because you did so much reporting, now you get to ask the questions.
Yeah, I loved it. I mean, I always thought that Face the Nation was the best job you could possibly have. Up until that point, I had covered the Congress, and I continued to cover the Congress. I covered Congress 15 years. That was my all-time favorite beat, really. But to me, Face the Nation, I mean, you didn't even have to go to them. They came to you. You know, and that's what I loved about it, and I still do. I still found it the most interesting, and I mean, you know, the big stories like Watergate, 9/11, the Kennedy assassination. Those were in Vietnam. Those were the big stories of my life. But on a weekly basis, just the intellectual challenge of Face the Nation and trying to figure out how to, you know, ask a question that nobody else had asked or something. That was really the most challenging, and I really enjoyed it, thoroughly enjoyed it.
Many of us would watch Tim Russert on Meet the Press, and then Face the Nation for a long time was at 10:30 Eastern, so it was 30 minutes, and then finally they gave you the hour. Yeah. And it was a different perspective on the same stories, but the point of mentioning that is also, as Bob said, the news people that you were interviewing, they came to you. Donald Trump changed that by phoning in appearances, which never would have been allowed before, right?
No, we wouldn't have done it in those days. But this was a campaign, and this was a very different kind of campaign. It's the most unusual campaign that I ever encountered, and maybe the most unusual in history. But Donald Trump, and I preface this by saying he was a good enough politician to get himself elected president, so I give him credit for that. But I never thought he was that good a politician. What I thought he was very good at understanding television and how television worked. And what he figured out early on was that if he offered himself to a number of television programs, a certain number were going to put him on. And if he said something a little bit outrageous or a little bit different, or, you know, sometimes just off the cuff, and made news, then others were going to invite him to do that. And he just overwhelmed first the Republicans and then Hillary Clinton with his exposure. We took a lot of heat for not pushing back. Well, the fact is we did push back, maybe not as much as we should, but we did push back. But he was on so much that he just smothered the competition. And I asked Mika Brzezinski on the Morning Joe show one time, and she's quoted in the book. I said, Mika, you know, you have Donald Trump on 3 times a week. Why don't you ever have Hillary Clinton on? And she said, let me tell you something, Bob. She said, getting Hillary Clinton on is like getting an interview with Mother Teresa. And she's dead, of course. And I think in that sentence, it kind of summed up that campaign. She was running the old-fashioned kind of campaign where you never put your candidate in a position where he or she might be asked a question that they don't know the answer to. You want to exercise very tight control on their personal appearances and where they appear and how often they appear. You don't do many interviews. And Trump was just on every 5 minutes. And where his genius was, and I don't even think he sometimes understood, well, he did understand, but he didn't know the name for it. There was a political consultant in Australia named Linton Crosby, and he had what he termed the dead cat theory of political strategy. And this was, if you're having a dinner party, it doesn't make any difference what the conversation is about. If you throw a dead cat in the middle of the table, everybody's going to start talking about the dead cat. Well, stop and think about Donald Trump and how he ran this campaign. the campaign, the conversation be going in this direction or that direction, and then all of a sudden he'd send out a tweet or get on Morning Joe and say something, and suddenly the rest of the day, everybody in politics was reacting to what he had said that morning. And I think the fact that he figured out if he said it early in the morning, that was the way to make the campaign continue to be about him. And it worked. And it worked. And it was an effective strategy. I thought she ran a terrible campaign in many different ways. I think she, in many ways, had as much to do with how the election came out as he did, in my view. That's my opinion, clearly stated. But that's what I think. Having said that, I'm not sure that's the proper strategy to run the presidency. And if I had a criticism of Donald Trump as president, I think sometimes it's better to think before you speak. Maybe he does, I don't know.
As an interviewer,
yes.
Is he a hard guy to interview? Because he drifts off, he obfuscates.
I'll tell you something very interesting about that. The times I've interviewed him, I've had very businesslike and very successful interviews. And I've interviewed him numerous times over the years. But the first time I ever interviewed him, and the first time I ever met him, I don't know if you all recall, but the city of New York could not get the ice rink to freeze over in Central Park, and they spent something like $11 million. And Donald Trump was this young entrepreneur, and he came along and said, "Let me have the job. I'll get this working." And in 3 months, he had ice freezing over and people skating in Central Park. It was a great story. It was, private enterprise triumphs over bumbling bureaucracy and all of that. And so I went up and interviewed him. There was no Trump Tower in those days, but he had his office up, high above New York somewhere. I don't remember what building. And we had a great interview, and it was a great story. We did it on the evening news. And then in 2012, when he was thinking about running for president, and he hadn't made up his mind, it was about the time of the Florida primary, I went down to Mar-a-Lago and did an interview with him. And last year during the campaign, I went back and looked at the interview, and it was a template for the campaign he the campaign that he ran in 2016. He said, "Bob, I just want to make America great again. Here's what I want to do." And you could just almost see the plan he set out for himself in 2016 in that interview. As it turned out, he didn't run, obviously, but it was, to me anyway, it was remarkable to see how he laid out his plan in that interview.
We've seen you in the debates of presidential candidates. Yeah. And the decorum that you've always conducted yourself in. And then you see these almost food fights of presidential candidates. Did you cringe when you watched some of those?
Yeah. I did. After the debate in Las Vegas, was that the third debate? I said that I thought it was absolutely disgraceful. And I thought it was shameful on all sides. But this was a very unusual kind of campaign. This wasn't a campaign about issues so much as it was about attitude. And we were criticized for taking Trump literally but not seriously, while his fans in many cases took him seriously but not literally. And I think that's one of the things we didn't quite figure it out. Although I'd interviewed him many times, I'd never heard him on the stump. And in the South Carolina primary, I went down there and went out to one of his rallies just because I wanted to see the crowd and this young reporter who was working with me, Lucy Boyd, who actually wrote one of the best chapters in the book on fake news. And I had done a fellowship up at Harvard, and she was my kind of graduate assistant up there, and I later hired her to work with me last year at CBS News. And I don't think Lucy had ever been to a political rally up until that point. She had been a school teacher and taught in the inner city schools in Newark for 3 years, Teach for America, and then went to Harvard to get her graduate degree, and very, very smart. And I said, Lucy, here's what we'll do, and this was before he spoke. I said, you take that side of the room, I'll take this side of the room, and just go ask people why they like Donald Trump, and see what they say. Well, we probably, between the two of us, interviewed 40 people. You know, these were just, why are you here? Why do you like Donald Trump? And I would say 95% of the people said, I just like him because he's not afraid to speak his mind. He's not afraid to speak out and tell us what his view is. And neither of us ran into anybody that said, I like him, because he took this position or that position. I just like him because he was not afraid to speak out. And after the election, I had a long-time commitment in Houston, down at the MD Anderson Hospital, and I was flying down there the day after the election, and I was sitting next to a young military officer, a woman, who was Hispanic. And so, as I always do, we got talking. I said, who'd you vote for? And she said, I voted for Donald Trump. And I said, really? I said, tell me why you voted for him. And she said exactly the same thing. She said, I liked him because he was not afraid to speak his mind. And I said, how did you feel about immigration? She said, I'm very concerned about it. She said, I never believed that he was going to build that wall. But she said, that said to me that he was concerned about immigration. And she said, that's the part I liked about it. And again, it went back to what I'd found out in that rally. It was more about attitude than it was about literal promises and things.
We're going to be taking questions from students and the general public in the next few moments. One of the great things in this book, Overload, and I hope you all will get a copy of it, is you learn where people get their news. I think, and I hope I quote you right, Bob, 52% of Americans say they get it from television. But when you go through the demographics and you lower the age and you get below 30, it's frightening how few, and we asked students at Embry-Riddle, they said Yahoo and other online sources, it's not television.
No, and in fact, when I started the book about a year and a half ago, the Pew Foundation, which is a very good source, by the way, they're very credible. They do the best polling of anybody, I think. They told me that 62% of Americans get at least some of their news off social media. By the time I got through with the book, that was up to 67%. And what we're seeing now is that a large part of that 67%, that's their only source of news, because they're living out in these parts of the country where there are no newspapers anymore. Many of them in the lower economic levels can no longer afford to pay the high fees for cable, so they're not getting CNN or Fox or any of the cable. Many people in this country now, their only connection with news is what their browser kicks up by mistake. Or not by mistake, it's just what happens to show up. They're not reading newspapers. And one of the really concerning things is there's no question now that we're moving to digital, and I think the newspapers that are going to survive, it's going to be by putting more emphasis on their digital product. The good news is the big newspapers like the Washington Post and the New York Times, they have figured this out. They've totally reinvented themselves now. The Post, for example, which has a circulation of the paper newspaper in Washington of about 400,000. They are now, through their digital product, are now reaching as many as 70 million people in some months.
Wow.
And the New York Times is doing that. The Post is becoming an international newspaper now, where it's always been basically a local newspaper for Washington and was the number one, go-to place for political news. But they have broadened out by doing this, and that's the good news. And if local newspapers are going to survive, it will be doing what what these papers are doing now by putting the new emphasis on the digital product. The Post, for example, they now put out their news on at least 5 platforms, and they're like a wire service used to be. They have a bulletin service. They have a newsletter. They offer running coverage when a big story breaks, and they're doing, and then putting out the newspaper every morning. And I think the local papers, I think what we may see now, and I don't know if this is why the FCC did it, but they've just passed this rule now where they're going to again allow people to own a newspaper and a television station in the same town. I think what we will see as a result of that, some forward-thinking owners will combine the news staff of the newspaper and the television station. The television station is going to reach more people, but the newspaper, if they can, afford more reporters, can produce most of the news content. I think actually that would be a very good thing.
Everything that's old is new again. I worked for the Providence Journal-Bulletin in 1981, and the radio station, which was all news, was a department within the newspaper.
Yeah.
Then they sold the radio stations, couldn't buy anymore, and under this change, they could go back, and the paper could buy radio, or radio could buy them.
Yeah.
The Seattle Post Intelligentsia is totally online now. I don't even think they do a published.
I'm not even sure there is a Post Intelligentsia anymore. Yeah. There may be. I don't know.
It was just
the
online.
Seattle Times is the major newspaper out there now. But it's funny you should bring that up. My last post for the last year I was in the Air Force, I got out in 1962, was at Tacoma, Washington, and 67th Air Transport Wing in Tacoma, Washington. But anyway, I got out in 7th September. I always remember going in and getting out the military way. I don't say September 7th. I say 7th September. It's just in my mind that way. But I was offered a job as the real estate editor of the Seattle Post Intelligencer, and I turned it down. And I went back to Texas. I've often thought, how that would have impacted on my career had I taken that job. But it was a very nice offer, but I didn't want to do it.
Call Bob for this house. Wow.
Right.
One of our listeners sent me an email today to radio and said that when you were retiring from Face the Nation, you made a statement, and I'm hoping this is correct. Quote from you, Bob: "We now don't know where people get their news, but what we do know is that they are bombarded with information 24 hours a day, 7 days a week." You said this on CBS this morning. "Most of the information is wrong, and some of it wrong on purpose. It is our job, I think, in mainstream journalism to try to cut through this mall of information and tell people what we think is relevant and what they need to know about." Do you still believe in that?
Yeah, that's why I wrote this book. And that's why, number one, I said this to some of the folks at the little pre-meeting we had over in the other room. Walt Mossberg, the great technology writer, first for the Wall Street Journal and later came to write this blog, and now is a major part of Vox, which is a very good network of digital sites, and they do real journalism and all of that. He once said, when you're in the middle of something, sometimes you don't realize what's going on. And I think that's what's going on here. We're in the middle of this complete revolution in how we get the news and the impact and that is having on our politics. And I think we need to, number one, be aware of where we are. That's the first step. And number two, it sounds, so elementary to say it, but make sure you know where this news is coming from before you pass it on, or even more so, before you take it as true, because so many times now it simply isn't true. And many times, as I said earlier, not true on purpose. And this is having a real impact beyond our just journalism. It's having an impact on the culture itself.
We'd like to bring students down and the general public. We have 2 microphones. If you would quickly, in this incredible opportunity to ask a question of Bob Schieffer, come right down, line up behind either mic. We ask our students to please state your name, your field of study, years here at Embry-Riddle, or if you're from one of the visiting other universities and colleges, please do that. Before we take that question, when you decided to retire from Face the Nation, you picked John Dickerson, didn't you?
I did. I mean, I don't do the hiring, and I should emphasize that. That's done by David Rhodes, who's my boss. But John was my choice, and I just thought he was perfect for the job. And I also knew his mom, who was Nancy Dickerson, who was the first female correspondent at CBS News. And before she was a correspondent, she was an associate producer on Face the Nation. And I came to Washington in 1969. By then, she had moved from CBS over to NBC. But I knew her and worked with her, and she was a lovely person. And John is just terrific. And I'm so happy with the way the program has worked out. And the executive producer is Mary Hager. And Mary was my partner on Face the Nation. We moved to #1 in the ratings while Mary was the executive producer. And Mary had gone to work for me about 25 years ago. And I say work for me. She had worked with me when I was the Capitol Hill correspondent, and she was a young producer. And so I just couldn't be happier with the way they're doing it. But it's really hard.
Let's take our first question, and we have an open mic over here as well.
Yeah.
Good evening and welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Bernier. Hi, Bob. My name is Mickey. I grew up
Mickey.
Hi, it's an honor. I grew up in the D.C. area. I recently moved here about a year ago. And this whole fake news thing that just emerged and erupted with our previous election, I'm wondering if you see it as kind of a second coming of something that happened before the internet, where maybe false news and lies maybe exerted themselves upon our government and maybe had a stranglehold or a foothold in there for the past 40 years, that this was a backlash to, maybe a resurgence of that being exploited and manipulated, a certain rebellion against that maybe corrupted moral compass in leadership and government being meddled with by people that have interest against the USA.
Well, I think all of the above. I think that, we've had lies, we've had, in the time of the writing of the Constitution, it was much more vicious than it is now. And objectivity, in those days, there was no such thing as objectivity. Everybody came at it from a certain point of view. And I think what we kind of think of as objectivity now kind of came about in post-World War II, really. And we've always had, but the difference now is that the speed with which this stuff can be disseminated. And now, when I went to work at the Star-Telegram way back there in the dark ages, there was a big argument about whether journalists ought to be licensed like other professionals, like doctors and lawyers. And we all argued, no, our license is the First Amendment. And if you got a barrel of ink and a printing press, you're a publisher, and you can publish anything, and unless it's false and you're sued, you're free to write whatever you want to write about. Well, now you don't need the barrel of ink, you don't need the printing press. All of us are publishers. Everybody that has a phone has access to the web. And once this stuff gets out there that is false, you cannot take it down. I'm sure all of you have heard about this story in Washington about that Hillary Clinton was running a child pornography ring in the basement of this ping pong pizza parlor. That's the name of it. They have a ping pong table. It's a family place. Wow. And the story was totally without foundation. It had no basis in fact whatsoever. Yet somebody came from another state with a rifle, walked in and shot one of the doorknobs off the doors, because he was going to go down in the basement and rescue these children that were supposed to be being held hostage there. Well, the first thing he discovered, of course, there was no basement to this place, and so the police came and he was taken away, and he's in the justice system now. But the man that owns that pizza parlor still has to have private security, which he hires and pays for, because he's still getting death threats. You can't, once this stuff gets out there, it's impossible. Well, I mean, for example, Barack Obama is not a U.S. citizen. There is still a percentage of people in the United States who believe he is not a U.S. citizen and he wasn't born in this country. And I think it's generally agreed that there is no foundation for that it's totally incorrect. And it comes from the left and the right. And I think that's the important thing for all of us to understand. During the campaign last year, we came across a story that in 1992, Donald Trump had given an exclusive interview to People magazine, in which he said, if I ever get into politics, I'll become a Republican because they're the dumbest people on the face of the earth, and they believe everything they see on Fox News. Well, it turns out that the story was totally without foundation. It was a great little story, if it had been even an ounce of truth. There was no such interview. When it came over the internet, there was a picture of him on the cover of People magazine, graphics, everything about it looked real. It just wasn't true. It was totally without foundation. And yet, there it was. It popped up, and it was going all over. It went viral, as we say. People were talking about it everywhere. And now, with the Russians meddling around in here, and it makes it even more complicated. But we have to remember this stuff is just not true most of the time. And, if ever buyer beware was good advice, I would say it is now on that. And I don't know anybody, even in journalism, who depends on one source for their news. I advise you to find reliable sources and depend on them. I make a list of the websites that we consider good, reliable sources that you can trust in this book. But everything out there is just not true. Yes, sir.
Yes. When I went to journalism school, I was downgraded a whole letter grade because I said somebody was fortunately not arrested for something, and I was accused of editorializing. And then when I watched local news and national news, it seemed like there was rampant editorializing, just giving the facts of the news. What do you make of it?
Well, I think there is some. And I think, especially on some of the cables, I think you'll see a blending of fact and opinion, and I think they ought to be more careful about that. I think sometimes they do it because they have a certain amount of time to fill, and they're trying to offer analysis and offer balance, and sometimes the people that they put on, in my view, shouldn't be on, because they're not people who have legitimate opinions. I mean, how many times during the campaign did you see somebody and they'd be labeled Republican strategist, Democratic strategist? What does that mean? That they put out a yard sign or something like that? Most of the time, these people had no connection to the campaigns whatsoever. And I think it was, as bad on one side as it was on the other. I'm the old-fashioned kind. I think when you say something that's your opinion, you should say, that's my opinion. And I did Face the Nation for 24 years. I did a commentary at the end of every broadcast. But and it was at my insistence that we said commentary. We labeled it as commentary, just in case somebody might think that I was stating facts. And most of the time, I wasn't advocating anything. I was simply giving an analysis, saying what I think this means or what that means. But I think we could do a better job of that.
Thank you. Bob,
Yeah.
When the Monica Lewinsky story was out there, I watched as you covered it and on Face the Nation, and I know you were never really happy to be talking about this.
No.
You were very delicate how you referred to what the president was accused of and what he admitted to. And now it seems that every day we're hearing about sexual misconduct. And so I just found out something here that I missed earlier today. Charlie Rose has been now suspended by CBS, PBS, and Bloomberg amid sexual misconduct claims. Where does this all end?
Well, I tell you, I found out about that as I was walking in the door. I am absolutely stunned. I don't know what this is about. I have no comment to make because I don't know what I would say.
Yeah.
I mean, I have no idea. They seems like they've done a pretty thorough job here, but I don't know. I don't know what this is about, and I was just truly disheartened. I mean, Charlie's a friend of mine. I've known Charlie for 30 years.
You talked about this book on his show, I think, didn't you?
I did, and but I don't know. I don't know what this is about. And
under the umbrella of Harvey Weinstein first, and then every day there's a new thing, and it either hits media people or Hollywood people or politicians. I was in Miami last night. Al Franken was supposed to be there as part of the Miami Book Fair, and he canceled his tour amidst the stories now that has a new wrinkle today.
I don't know where this goes, but I mean, there are, this Harvey Weinstein thing is, I mean, how anybody could possibly defend something like that is beyond me. The Charlie thing, I'm just, my reaction right now, as I say, I don't know anything about it, and I've kind of tried to make a habit over the years of not commenting on things until I know something about what I'm talking about.
Fair enough.
So I will, I'm going to reserve any comment on that right now, but I just say I'm just totally, I mean, I couldn't believe it when I heard it, and I'll find out more about it later and report back to you, but right now I just don't know what to say.
Fair enough. Your question now for Bob.
Good evening, sir. I'm a student here at Embry-Riddle. My name is Sarah Fairchild. I'm a freshman in aviation maintenance science. As a student at Embry-Riddle, I'm not rich enough to afford a TV in my dorm, so...
I'm sorry, could you
Slow that down just a little.
You got it.
For me. And
My
I
apologies.
speak fast.
I just, the mic is muffled or something.
If you could go right into the mic instead of from the
there
side.
you
Is this
go.
better?
Better.
All right.
Just take your time and ask your question.
Okay.
All right. My name is Sarah Fairchild. I'm a freshman in aviation maintenance science here at Embry-Riddle.
Okay.
As a student at Embry-Riddle, I'm not rich enough to afford a TV in my dorm.
Yes,
so,
no TV.
Right. So my way of getting news is limited, as you would say. Do you think, I found myself watching satirical commentators, and I find that they do a
The who?
satirical comment.
The talk shows, like you
Yes.
wrote about,
Oh,
Jon
yeah.
Stewart.
Yes. Yeah.
I find that they do an interesting job of covering the news, and I was wondering if you thought that they do a better job of covering news nowadays than mainstream media journalists.
I think they do a great job. And here's, when Jon Stewart first, this is probably when you were just a baby, when he first started doing that show, it was just, people were just, they said, oh my God, this is the only place that young people are getting their news, and they're not going to get the true story. And my answer was, I said, look, if you don't follow the news, if you're not up on the news, you're not going to get Jon Stewart's jokes. So I think that young people are far more informed than we gave them credit for in those days, and certainly more so today. But here's what I think about Jon Stewart and Stephen Colbert and people like that. To me, they are to television what the editorial page cartoonist is to the newspaper. And the editorial page cartoonist is the only person on the newspaper that has a right to lie. Because, they're operating in parody, they're operating in irony. And a lot of times the way you get to the truth is by taking things one step beyond where they are. And that's what they're so good at. So I think they're doing a great job. I think they add a great deal to it. But I would also say this. I don't think you can consider yourself fully informed if the only news you follow is what the editorial page cartoonist draws. In the same way with Jon Stewart and Colbert and those guys. I think you've got to follow the news, and that adds to your knowledge and helps your understanding. But I don't think you'd want to depend on either of those sources alone. That would be my advice.
Your
Yes,
question.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for being here and sharing the information with us. My name's Nicholas Cluck. I'm a freshman aeronautical science major here at the university, and I'm also minoring in business. Having someone like President Trump in office, someone who is certainly tested in business and in industry, someone who's been super successful in business, I'm curious, do you believe people and politicians coming into politics from the business aspect, how they're tearing down the sort of line between business and politics? Having someone like President Trump, I know the thing that turned me on to voting for Trump was his business aspect, how he could put that kind of spin on today's politics and running it more like a business. I was wondering your thoughts on that.
Well, I would just say this. I wish you wouldn't tweet. That's what I wish. And I think that might work in a campaign, but I don't think it works from the office of the presidency. Having said that, I think he came to office. He laid out what he wanted to do. He said he wanted to make the country great again. I think most of us would agree with that. I think he's had some good ideas along the line and some bad ideas, but I think he's had a difficult time organizing the presidency. And I say that in this way. This is the most unusual presidency I can recall. And people, because I covered 4 beats, the State Department, the White House, Capitol Hill, and the Pentagon, people always would ask me, well, what is your favorite beat? I'll bet it's the White House, right? And I say, well, yeah, it's good. When you get to go on these trips and you get great luggage tags and all that kind of thing. But I said, the thing about covering the White House is they all work for the same guy. And you're not always going to get much news. And I said, what my favorite beat always was and remains today was covering Capitol Hill. Because you get up there and they're all independent contractors. And, you're going to find out, you go to this guy and he'll tell you, this, and you go to this one and he'll tell you just the opposite because, they're on opposite sides of things. And for a reporter, that's where you want to be, where there's news. But that's no longer apt because this White House, there is many factions inside this White House now as there are on Capitol Hill. And they all talk about each other. They all have separate agendas. And it's confusing to say the least, but that's why you get so much news out of there. I have never seen a White House where so many people talk about the other people in the White House. I mean, and most of the time in the White House, as I say, they all work for the same guy. So you're going to get pretty much the same story from everybody. But that's not the case here, and I think that's been the main problem that he has. And when you look at it, what Donald Trump ran was a kind of a mom and pop grocery store that was involved in billions of dollars in the real estate company, and mostly it was just his family. And that's not how most large businesses operate. They have boards of directors, and well, I mean, I'm not telling you all anything. You all understand that. And I still think if they could find someone who could bring order to this White House, I think they would be more successful. And it looked for a while like his chief of staff was going to be that person, but I'm not sure that's going to work either. So we'll see what happens, but I still think they're still organizing over there. And I think what we're seeing at the State Department, where they're not nominating people to fill all these key posts, and the Secretary of State seems to be operating kind of like the Lone Ranger. And I don't know, I just don't know how long that can go on. I think the Pentagon's in pretty good shape right now, would be the way I'd look at it.
We have opportunities for a few more. In 1999, when you were here in February, we had a radio listener. Her name was Joellen, and she was a regular viewer of Face the Nation. And she was quite upset that the network and I guess this particular program, Face the Nation, did not cover the Clinton saga in quite the way that she had hoped to. And you said...
I guess she must be dead by now, wouldn't you think? I mean, she's still around.
Still around. Her quote was, your quote was, well, madam, there's a particular thing about television that can be fascinating. It's called selective listening.
Yeah.
Because you were saying that you were covering all this, but people, I guess, wanted more to their point. Does that happen to you as a reporter, where you'll bump into somebody at a grocery store and they'll say, why didn't you guys report on this?
Oh, sure. And I mean, that's just human nature. And I mean, my young brother when he was right out of graduate school, he got himself elected to the Texas legislature. And for a time, he was the youngest member of the legislature. And, anytime somebody would say he parted his hair the wrong way or something, I would just be furious about it, because this was my brother, and it just seemed like it was biased and they weren't treating him right. And, but then once he was done with it, I realized that, well, maybe I was biased. Maybe I was, the only coverage I wanted him to get was great coverage. And
so biased listening.
And so I think sometimes bias can be in the eye and the ear of the beholder, but that does not mean there's not bias out there. Look, this is a human enterprise, and I guess every news organization has someone that you would think is biased. I mean, but I think by and large, most of the reporters I know, the overwhelming number of reporters that I know and have worked with over the years, are people who are simply trying to get the story and get the story right and get it before their competitor gets it. And I think that's what their agenda is. And I don't buy this, that all of the press is biased. But I think... let me just add this to this, because I consider this very important and very serious. The press is always under attack. I can never recall any president that really liked the press and thought he was getting a fair deal while he was president. I mean, and why should they? I mean, and if you're there getting hit on every day, why wouldn't you be upset with it and so forth? But here's the deal, and here's the important thing. We cannot have a democracy as we know it unless we have independently gathered information that citizens can compare to the government's version of events and then decide what to do about it. That's our job. We have a totally different mission than the politician. The politician is there to deliver a message. Our job is not to argue with him or to advocate a different message. Our job is simply to check out his message and report if it's true or false and what its impact is going to be on the electorate, on the citizens, on you folks sitting out there. We're not always going to be the most popular person in the room, but we're not supposed to be. Our job is to simply keep an eye on the government and report on what it's doing. And that's not always going to please the people in the government. But who in the world would want a government where the only source of news was the government? We've never put up with anything like that in this country, and we never will. And so when people call us names and stuff, I've been called every name you can be called. I mean, I was there for Vice President Agnew and the nattering nabobs of negativity. And last year during the campaign, someone called me a female hygiene device.
Wow. Wow.
So I've been called everything, but that's part of the job, and that doesn't bother me, and you laugh about it. I mean, I told a guy, that's what the sissies called people back where I grew up. I mean, if you want to call me a real bad name, you got to do better than that. but having said that, it does seriously concern me when we find people at the highest levels of government or in the darkest corner of some mama's bedroom at 3 o'clock in the morning who tried to destroy the credibility of the press, because when they do that, they are damaging the foundations on which this country is built. And I take that very seriously, and I do everything I can to explain to people what it is we do and why we do it. And that's really why I wrote this book.
We have a few students left. Your question, please. Right into the mic.
Hi, Bob. Thank you for coming. My name is Zachary Stanley. I'm a freshman here at Embry-Riddle. My major is Homeland Security, and here's my question. So my question begins with a concept coined by Ashutosh Varshney, who did a political study in India. That concept is polarization, which commonly leads to political violence. So in our society today, as well as the other people in the audience, I'm sure as well feel, but I usually feel that I am polarized, whether it's through my religion, a race, gender, or even just our political ideologies. Do you believe that this recent polarization is the cause of biased news or fake news, or our president, or our recent findings of Russia intelligence meddling in our election? And how do you think we should fix this?
Well, I think all of those are a factor in this, but I agree with you. I think the country is more polarized today than any time since 1968, when the country almost came apart. I mean, I think it really did almost come apart. It didn't in 1968 over the Vietnam War. But I think it goes beyond this recent presidential campaign. It goes beyond the technology revolution it's going through. What has happened is I think the chickens have finally come home to roost in our electoral system, and that is how we select the people that we now select. We spent more than $2 billion last year on this presidential campaign. But the system has become so overwhelmed by money. It is so in need of reform that we wound up with two candidates that a majority of the American people neither liked nor trusted. And I think when that happens, you have to say, what happened here? How did this happen? I mean, I think Hillary Clinton was eminently qualified to be a presidential candidate. She had a national following. She had been a very good senator for her state in New York. But my question was, is she the only candidate that has a national following on the Democratic side? And when her main challenger turned out to be a person who's not even a Democrat, who basically said he's not a capitalist. I've been covering politics for a long, long time, and I can never recall anybody running for an office, whether it was city council or president of the United States, who said he was not a capitalist. I mean, this country is founded on the private enterprise system, and yet he almost beat her for the Democratic nomination. And then on the other side, you had a reality TV star as a candidate. And I just wonder, how did that happen? And I think it happened because of the way that our electoral system is just, it's coming apart. There are fewer people who identify themselves as Democrats now, and fewer people that identify themselves as Republicans, the fewest in the history of our political parties. The parties themselves, which once sort of controlled things, once people were able to raise their own money, then the parties were no longer as powerful as they once were. And I think that's had an impact on who our candidates are. But here's one of the most interesting statistics I found when I was writing this book. In 1975, after Watergate, 32 people either paid substantial fines or went to prison for campaign finance law violations. Now, every single thing that they went to prison or paid substantial fines for is now legal.
Wow.
Is now legal. We have no campaign laws anymore. You can just kind of do what you want to. And until we're able to kind of reform this system, here's the worst indictment of our political system that I can think of right now. When I was a little boy, my grandmother thought I was going to grow up to be President of the United States of America. And you know why she thought that? Because that's what every grandmother thought about her grandson. Now I ask you this question. How long has it been since you've run into anyone who says, I hope my child grows up to be a politician? We've got to change that. We've got to find a way to change that. Our best and brightest people are no longer turning to public service and are no longer running for public office. And what used to be a great honor is now seen as, I had this young woman working for me a couple of years ago, and she started dating a congressman in Washington. He was a fine young man. He was just as fine as he could be. And she went home and told her dad, and it was like he said, you know, she had come home and said, Dad, I've just met this bank robber, and I think you're really going to like him. I mean, he didn't care if he was a Democrat or a Republican or whatever. He just wanted nobody that had anything to do with politics fooling with his daughter, as it were. And that's kind of where we are. And that is the bottom line. We've got to find a way to get our best and brightest people again interested in public service. And it's not going to start in Washington. It's going to start with people your age. And it'll go from where you are up to Washington because my generation has screwed it up beyond all, and all fixing. We got to do better.
Let's go to the left now.
Okay.
Good evening and welcome.
Good question.
Hi. You kind of touched a little bit on what I was going to ask, but I want to expand on it and see what it is that you think. Your book and what you're mentioning is about this kind of deluge of fake news that's coming out.
Well, but a deluge of true and false. I mean...
Yeah. And what I'm curious about also is the fact that there seems to be also this movement towards taking the legitimate places of journalism and saying they're fake when they're not. And the reason why that's of concern to me is I'm a scientist from the scientific community, and for years we've been facing this whole movement of, for political expediency, people in positions of power just deny the validity of science. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious about how you see it affecting your field as well, that this is going on now, that if we just don't like the truth, we say it's not true.
Well, and that's often the reaction, and what we're finding, and this started long before the web, but with the coming of cable, we developed, what we call these validation channels, as it were. And if you listen to this channel or listen to this program on the radio, you're going to get one set of facts, and you listen to over on this side, you're going to get a totally different set of facts. In the old days, when most of us got our news from, say, one of the 3 television stations in our town or our local newspaper, we were basing our opinions on common facts, on common data. And what's made this divide so much greater now is we're no longer basing our opinions on the same data. And that, again, has broadened this divide that's going on, and that is definitely one of the reasons that we're having such polarization. And I think, what's kind of interesting about this awful business about sexual harassment that's going on right now, and you're almost seeing this saying, well, if he's on my side, it's okay, but if he's on this side, it's not okay. And, there's some things that are just right and wrong. And I think we got to get back to that. But again, we're so polarized now. I mean, when I came to Washington, I used to, and whatever beat I covered, I always basically was a political reporter and had been at the newspaper toward the end. But we used to have Republicans over, and we'd have Democrats over. They all knew each other. Their wives knew each other. Their kids went to school in Washington. Well, now nobody even brings their families to Washington anymore. The families stay behind. They're only there about 3 days, and they just don't know each other anymore, amongst other things. And they have to get back to raise these enormous amounts of money that they all have to raise in order to stay in office. So it's now kind of a conversation among strangers rather than a conversation among people who know each other. And I think, again, that's part of the problem that we have right now. I mean, they ought to be in Washington, you know, and we need to find some way that they're legislating there. And you know, there are all kind of laws you could pass. I mean, when they're there, all they do is go to fundraisers at night. And these things have become so pro forma that they don't even send, you know, you just come and bring your check and leave it. And they write down your name. And that's about the way it works now. In Republicans and Democrats, members of the House are expected to spend, I think it's 20 hours a week making cold calls to ask people for money. Well, who wants to spend your life that way? I mean, you know, what could be worse than that, just calling people up and asking them for money? And more people are just saying, I just don't want anything to do with it. And I think that's where the problem is.
We have time for only 2 more questions, unfortunately, and then we're going to our book signing. Let's step up right here. Your question very briefly and quickly, and then we'll take one from the left. Go ahead.
My name is James Bennett. I'm a sophomore here studying aerospace engineering. And my question is, with the increased polarization of the American population, would you say that even the perceived media bias has increased with it? And do you think that certain organizations are trying to push for more of a reactionary story instead of a factual story?
Well, I mean, everybody, you know, what's going on now is if you don't like the story, you say the media is biased. If you do like the story, the media is not biased. And you know, it's just as simple as that. But because it's so intense now, and the news is coming at us from so many different places now, 24/7. I mean, but what we've got to do is kind of get this all sorted out. I mean, the problem is, we're overwhelmed with information, but we don't have enough curators. And in a more orderly time, I mean, that's what a newspaper is. It's a curation of the news of the day. The Encyclopedia Britannica used to be a kind of a curation of what the editors thought was the knowledge of the Western world. And right now, we have no curation going on. We're just bombarded with this stuff. And, you know, you have to sit down and say, wait, I need to check this to see if this is true, and check this. And it is just a jumble. And I think it's just left people overwhelmed, and it just wears you out. I mean, I get up some mornings, and this is what I do. This is what I've done all my life. And sometimes I'm almost hesitant to pick up the paper for fear of what I'll find today that, you know, I had no idea was going to happen yesterday. And I think we're all just a little news weary right now, for want of a better word. Okay, over
Yes,
here.
sir.
This is it, man. You're the anchor. You're going to bring us to a conclusion.
Disappoint.
Here.
I want to thank the gentleman to my right for giving me the opportunity to say this. He was waiting for a while, but he let me step up.
Well, isn't that good?
Anyway, I wanted to ask. So
We'll give him a little off on his book. When
that'd be nice. Really good.
Make him a family price.
Given the prevalence of the internet with news today, I know that this month or next they're going to have a big decision again regarding net neutrality.
About what?
Net neutrality?
Yeah.
And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, given how important it is today when it comes to people getting their news.
You know, I'll tell you this. I heard Ross Perot once say he never gave people advice on the stock market for fear they might take it and might think he knew more than they did. And this is a question that is so complex that I really am not qualified to give you an answer like that. And I'm not trying to evade the question. I just don't know enough about it to give you a reasonable answer. And I think sometimes in news, we should be more willing to say that. And I wish I could give you an answer on that, and I just don't know enough about it
I
to give
respect
you a
that.
good
Thank you.
answer. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much. Before Bob signs, I want to thank some people, Amy and Hannah and Sterling and Sundus, for helping with all of the arrangements tonight so that you could all have seats, and our friends from the bookstore, Kaylee and Jenna, Bob Score, who has videoed all of these things, and Tony and Matt up in control. Thank you so much. And to my boss, Ann, for having the faith for us to be able to put these Can I
events
just
on.
also say thank you very much for being a very good audience, and I really enjoyed being here. Thank you all.